Well, free childcare ends today, and that means the sector will begin to transition back to the pre-COVID fee and subsidy system. From today, parents can be charged full fees. However, childcare centres cannot make them higher than they were in late February. The government will also recommence the childcare subsidy payment system, but the activity test to access payments will be eased until October 4 to ensure parents whose jobs have been impacted can access up to 100 hours per fortnight of paid care. On July 20, JobKeeper ends for employees at childcare centres. Childcare is so far the only sector to have these payments removed. That will be replaced by government transition payments of up to 25% of the business service fees, which will be available until September 27. Today's changes, however, will not be applied to areas back in lockdown in Victoria.
When it comes to Victoria, we've also made special arrangements by allowing the childcare providers to waive that pay gap. And that gives confidence to the parents that they won't lose that position of enrolment. It gives confidence to the childcare providers because they continue to receive that childcare subsidy. And of course, it's helped maintaining the viability of our systems and our centres.
But with fears of a new wave of cases across the country, many in the sector have expressed concern that parents will be forced to choose between paying fees or pulling their children out of care altogether.
The lockdown now is becoming more serious than it was before because it's in the community. People are picking it up in the community. If we shut down for 2 weeks, we don't have a safety net. We may not have a safety net for the government, so what's going to happen? So we've just gone through 3 months where we had to scramble and recover, and now we don't know what's going to happen from now till Christmas. Our landlord's had 4 months where he's actually starting to go, I can't keep this up. Fair enough. So we've gone to full rent, full fees, but full costs as well. And our parents have started to feel the pinch, and some have lost jobs. They're starting to lose jobs now that they hadn't lost before. People who had full time have dropped a day or two. People who were on 4 days have dropped down to 2 days. 2 days seems to be about the point where most people want to hang on if they can, because they're getting assistance with those 2 days. But beyond that, there's so much uncertainty that nobody wants to take a chance.
Well, for more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by educational leader at the Flemington Childcare Cooperative and service manager at the Community Childcare Association, the Peak organisation for not-for-profit children's services in Victoria, Daniela Kavoukas. Thanks for your time, Daniela.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Before we discuss the ending of the free childcare, I just want to talk about the centre that you've been associated with. You've been here before. You were locked down in April, and once again you're locked down again. What sort of impact has this second lockdown going to have on the business?
About 3 weeks ago, we started to have families talk to us about reducing their time, so not coming in as Flemington went into its round of lockdown. So we started to see our attendance drop back then. Unfortunately, since then, we've had a positive case of COVID, so we're actually closed at the moment for 2 weeks while we're having everybody in isolation for 14 days and the centre have a deep clean. So we'll be closed for another week still at this point.
So what sort of financial impact is there on the centre for closing for a COVID clean?
So for Co-op, which is a very small centre, we only have 37 children, there's just over $20,000, probably $25,000 of impact to be closed for the fortnight.
Okay, so you briefly reopened after April, that first lockdown. What was your experience then? What were the numbers of places of kids taking up those childcare places?
So in April when they first announced, or in March when they first announced, people started to go into lockdown spaces then, our attendance was dropping down quite low. We went down to having 50% occupancy. And then when they announced free childcare, we were able to drop, our numbers went down to probably even 4 children a day. So we dropped down really low. And that stayed on for all of April, and throughout May, we started to have numbers increase as school returned back and people felt safe with children's services and getting that message across to families that the hygiene practices in children's centres are quite high. so it's okay to bring your children in.
So it looks like you're being hit from a number of angles here. We'll talk about the program, the $1.5 billion program of free childcare. That ends today. What sort of impact is that going to have on the business, as well as what are parents telling you about what it's going to mean for them and bringing their kids in to see you?
Families have started talking about whether they can afford to send their children for the days that they were. There's been a big shift in people realising that they have found another way to work around having their children at home if they are working from home, and what that means for them in their circumstances. So some families are dropping days. Some, while we're in Flemington, which has been one of the hot spots, have chosen to already say we're not going to be coming in over the next 6 or so weeks, which means that they were talking about pulling out their children for those days. And I suppose with the end of free childcare, it becomes very real that all of a sudden those fees are going back in. With the announcement of the waiving of the fees, we have a really tough position to be in as providers of childcare, because we have the choice to support our families to keep them enrolled in our centres and waive their fees. That has a big impact on services because we don't have the rest of that money coming in from the family's fees. There's a big gap there.
Jay Weatherill, the CEO of the Minderoo Thrive by 5 program, which champions reform to the early childhood development sector. You've said publicly that COVID has presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really reform this sector nationally. Firstly, where's it broken?
Well, early learning is an essential service, yet it hasn't survived the pandemic, and the Commonwealth's had to put these temporary arrangements in place. But the current system excludes many children from gaining access to that critical early learning opportunities in the first 5 years, where we know that 90% of a child's brain develops. We know that many women, and usually women, but the second income earner, are excluded from being able to take anything other than part-time employment because of the way in which our childcare system operates. And thirdly, this is a massive cost of living issue. I mean, a couple of $100 a week for a typical family for childcare at a time when their incomes are low and going to be even lower with the effects of losses of jobs and shifts through COVID, means that this puts real pressure on families. So it is a broken system. There is an opportunity to reform it. The benefits are extraordinary. The benefits in terms of the way in which a child develops, but also in terms of our economy, and a massive important short-term opportunity for us in terms of employment. We know that this crisis has hit women in particular harder. There are massive employment opportunities if we're able to expand the early learning sector and get high quality learning being applied for children. So there's a big opportunity here to take a system that's broken and has been revealed as being broken and actually rebuild it out of the ashes of a failed system. Now,
Parnell, I know you've got some ideas on how to rebuild the system, but before I come to you, Jay, what are just briefly some ideas that would come into your reform agenda?
Well, quality first. And it's high quality early learning centres like the Flemington Centre that we need to protect rather than have them put under pressure. It's secondly making sure it's universal, making sure that every child that wants access to these early learning opportunities get them. Should also have wraparound services to make sure that we support families. It should be connected to our education system so that we have a line of sight to those children right from birth. And finally, it should be place-based. It needs to look very different in different parts of the country as we tailor a service that meets the needs of every Australian. Okay,
Parnell, we heard their quality, universal access, place-based system. You've written that the age of industrialised childcare is coming to an end. What do you mean by that?
Well, I hope it's coming to an end. My editor went a little bit further than I did. What I'm saying is that the large childcare centres, the business model of the for-profit childcare centres is deeply broken, in my opinion. It is, it's essentially arranged so that you can make a scale economic play on children. Parents generally hate these these arrangements. So I know a lot of mothers have said to me that, you know, when they drop their small children off there, they come away crying. The child is crying. You know, I myself cried when I dropped my son there. It's a terrible experience all around. We also know that
not for everybody, though.
Not for everybody. There are some people who I'm sure will say it's great, but you know, everybody's got their own take on these things. But from a child development perspective, under twos don't do so well in a very large setting, in an impersonal setting with changing high turnover carers. It also doesn't work for the carers themselves. They're still very low paid and they often don't have very good conditions in these large arrangements. Now, this is all very different to what we're talking about with the co-op model that your guest was mentioning. Daniela, thank you. So that's that much smaller centre, 37 children, generally will have a much lower staff turnover and a much warmer atmosphere. And this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about, in fact, is that instead of effectively encouraging this large private provider model, which the government has done by putting funding towards those sort of models and accepting that, the funding should be tied to the child so that parents can start saying, well, actually, we want to perhaps even club together for a nanny with the subsidy that there is, or arrange a family daycare arrangement. There needs to be much more flexibility for parents and children.
So that sounds like flexibility is the key there. And I'll ask.
Flexibility will also get women back to work much more. You know, this is the other, being able to.
Well, I'll ask Anna because she's a working mum. A recent YouGov survey found that 2/3 of working mothers would accept a lower subsidy if they could use it to pay for more flexible forms of childcare. That was in your article, Parnell. Would this sort of flexibility appeal to you, Anna, as a working mum?
I think anything that makes it easier for any women I know and men as well who have taken on a primary caring role and are trying to get back into the workforce, anything that helps to give you more options is going to be a positive. And more people are involved in shift work in our society as well, and the daycare model doesn't necessarily meet that need very easily. But while we're talking about these sort of big long-term questions, there are some really short-term political issues for the government as well, because morale within the childcare sector at the moment is particularly low. What's happened over the course of the pandemic, remaining open for essential workers' children, the lack of certainty about the wages and the centres themselves remaining open has been an issue for the daycare providers, and then for parents making those choices about whether to send their kids, and now a situation where people have to work out whether they can crunch the numbers and even have care for their children, afford it while they go to work. There are these real pressures that are going to come to bear within the next few months, I think, and there are going to be a lot of tough choices for parents across Australia.
Tarang, we've got about a minute left on program. You've been nodding your heads throughout a lot of these responses. How do you think this system values women's work?
It's really interesting that kind of section of women's work, this concept of women's work. There's obviously a lot of stuff around flexibility, culturally specific and appropriate care arrangements, but we have to note that combined with super changes, the fact that women predominate the childcare sector and are being taken off JobKeeper, that this will inevitably lead to female poverty in old age. You know, one of the corollaries of the impact of COVID across genders is that it's the institutional response, not the disease itself, that is disproportionately impacting women. You know, so the government's been pumping money into building male-dominated professions, but female-dominated industries are being taken off first. I think it's very important that we look at the effect on women of COVID and apply a gendered lens so that we can actually make better arrangements for children and families.
Jay, I'll leave the last 30 seconds to you, and that's all we've got.
Sure. I mean, we know from some work that KPMG did that women taking up, well, the second earner, but typically women taking up the more than part-time work, they can actually end up paying for the privilege. So they're essentially locked into part-time employment. That works its way through, as your previous speaker has mentioned, the superannuation system. It also means that we're seeing women taking jobs which privilege flexibility rather than perhaps their highest and best use of their skills and capabilities. So it's a massive gender issue.
Lots of work to do given the discussions that we've had tonight, but we are out of time. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you to our panel. We had Parnell McGuinness, Anna Henderson, Jay Weatherall, Tarang Chawla, and of course to our guest, Daniela Kavoukas. I hope you all have an excellent evening. Stan Grant will be with you tomorrow. Good night.